Resuming debate, the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour, as always, to rise in this House representing the people of Timmins, James Bay. I have to say this is not a happy night because it represents yet another lower and lowering level within the House under this government in terms of their abuse of the system, the Westminster system that we certainly hold dear. When I say it's an honor to rise, and it's a privilege to rise and represent the people of Timmins, James Bay, they choose to have me here, and they will choose someday if I'm not to be here. And I respect that, and I understand that I have certain obligations to fulfill while I'm here. There's certain words we use. We use the word privilege. It's an interesting word. We have privileges as members of Parliament. For example, we have privileges that protect us from libel, so that if in a certain instance a question or a comment is heated, within the House we are able to debate that. Sometimes questions have to be asked that may later turn out to be unfounded, but as our role as parliamentarians is to question, to find out whether or not the people of Canada are being represented, we have to have certain privileges to keep us able to do that job. However, with the privilege comes a clear responsibility. Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleagues on the other side may not realize it, but we are legislators. Our job is to create the laws of Canada. And we're part of a larger legislative system, the Westminster tradition, Mr. Speaker, so that what is decided here in terms of precedents are looked at in other parliamentary democracies. And one of the key responsibilities that we have as members of Parliament is to speak truthfully in the House, meaning not to lie. That doesn't mean embellishment. That doesn't mean exaggerating. That doesn't mean zigzagging and avoiding. That's all happens within the House. But the obligation not to lie is a fundamental principle, because to lie is to mislead the work of parliamentarians. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to look at this situation and put it in context. The threshold for finding someone in a prima facie case of contempt is very, very, very rare. People apologize in this House for saying all manner of things all the time. It's considered after they make their apology that that's the end of it. If someone uses colorful language, I remember back in 2006 to Jim Prentice, who's also from Timmins, I think I used a colorful language about certain human behavior in a washroom in what I thought of his response, and I later said that wasn't appropriate, and I apologized. That was colorful. But that's different, Mr. Speaker, than attempting to mislead the work of Parliament and attempting to undermine. And what contempt is, Mr. Speaker, if you look up the dictionary, parliamentary contempt is interference with the work of Parliament. So, the three criteria that has been found against the member for Mississauga-Streetsville was that he made a statement that was false. In fact, he didn't say it once, he made that statement twice. That he knew it was misleading. And that he did it in an attempt to mislead the House. So let's look at what he did, Mr. Speaker. We're dealing with a bill, this Voter Suppression Act, which is a very disturbing piece of legislation, because what the government has decided to do is not deal with the issues that came out of the 2011 election, which had to do with widespread issues of voter suppression and voter fraud through robocalls. This was judged in a Canadian court system, and they found numerous cases of interference in the right to vote traced back to the Conservative database. Elections Canada was not able to identify the actual perpetrators because the Conservative Party interfered by not putting up any witnesses, interfered with their attempt to find witnesses. So all we know from that court finding was that across Canada, in key ridings, attempts were made to deny Canadians their right to vote, and the Conservative database was used. You would think that clearing up the Elections Act would be to ensure that the Elections Canada have the powers to subpoena witnesses and to examine and go in and examine who had access to that database where actual fraud occurred. But this bill, Mr. Speaker, doesn't deal with that at all. What it does is it flips the issue, so we're not talking in the House any longer about known cases of voter suppression and voter fraud by unknown Conservative operatives. Now the onus is on average Canadians. What the government is telling us is that it's average Canadians who are defrauding the system. There's not been one case, not one case brought forward that they could point to. So that's a problem, Mr. Speaker, because we have numerous instances, and I could name out the ridings where we know that voter fraud through robocalls happened. But they cannot give one instant of a Canadian citizen interfering, undermining, or voting fraudulently. So this gets to the issue of motivation. The member for Mississauga-Streetsville stands up in this House and claims to have witnessed a crime. That's an extraordinary thing. My colleagues on the other side, they're telling us that this is perfectly okay. Hey, you know, they say we all torque. That was the word they used, torque, or embellish. That's how we're conditioned. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, how it's seen as perfectly okay to walk into a legislature where laws are being decided and claim to have witnessed a crime that never occurred. But that's what the member for Mississauga-Streetsville said. He said, I have actually witnessed people picking up voter cards, going to the campaign office of whatever candidate they support, and handing out these voter cards to other individuals who then walk into voting stations with friends who vouch for them without no ID. He said he personally witnessed this crime. He then said later, I will relate something I have actually seen. This is what he claims. He claims to have witnessed a crime. I have seen campaign workers follow, pick up a dozen of these cards, and walk out. What are they doing? Well, Mr. Speaker, when you stand up and you attempt to mislead the House by claiming to have evidence when no evidence exists, when you claim to have witnessed crimes that never occurred, you have shown absolute contempt for the work of this Parliament, and you've shown contempt for the people who elected you. But, Mr. Speaker, our Conservative colleagues are saying, well, we're all conditioned to do that. Well, I don't believe we're all conditioned to do that. They say we all torque and embellish. I don't believe that we are here to lie to Canadians. I do not believe that. I do not believe that lying has any place in the House of Commons, and it certainly doesn't. This is what the parliamentary tradition tells us. But the Conservatives are telling us, well, you know, this is just the way things are done, and New Democrats are being mean for having pointed it out. You know, Mr. Speaker, this isn't the first time they've made these kind of claims up. The member of the minister right now for Heritage, do you remember her on May 3rd, 2012? She claimed to have witnessed crimes because she was under the gun for allegations that robo-fraud happened in her own riding. That robo-fraud was happening in her riding against the other parties. And so she claimed that, quote, hey, people called, hey, I got a call and was told to go to another polling station. Well, that's serious. If you knew that voter fraud was occurring, it would be incumbent upon you to call the authorities. Well, when she was pressed about where that voter fraud from other parties happened in her riding, well, then she retracted and said, sorry, maybe I misspoke. This is serious stuff because we're talking about whether or not crimes have occurred. Mr. Speaker, the issue of this is about a larger issue of abuse of our parliamentary system. It's about undermining the work of committees that has gone on since this government has received its majority mandate. It's about creating reports based on evidence when there's no evidence. We saw recently with the conflict of interest study where the government has completely gutted the basic principles of the Accountability Act and actually put into the report recommendations that were never heard. That witness after witness came and said we needed to strengthen the Conflict of Interest Act, and this Conservative government with their members came into the committee and made up recommendations out of thin air and then passed it at committee. That's what's happening in terms of undermining. And why is this serious, Mr. Speaker? Because in the Westminster tradition, we don't have all the checks and balances that they have in the U.S. legislative system. There's an understanding that people will act with a certain degree of honor, and that within the committees, it's where we're supposed to work together. We see now Bill C-520, where the member of York is now bringing power so that Conservatives who are under investigation can demand investigations of the Auditor General. The Conservatives who are under investigation for abusing the Lobbying Act can demand investigations of the Lobbying Commissioner. There's not a parliament in this anywhere in the Western world where those under investigation get to write laws to allow them to open investigations into the people whose job it is to hold parliamentarians and lobbyists to account. But in this topsy-turvy Conservative world, they believe that this bill is imperative. And I asked a member for York Centre the other day if he had one example to back up this bill, claiming that the agents of Parliament, that the Auditor Generals who are investigating his friends in the Senate, or the Ethics Commissioner who's investigated his friends on the Conservative front bench, or Elections Canada that are under attack from this government with a false claim that they're wearing a team jersey. I asked him if he could give me one example, and he couldn't. This is about creating a pattern of governing without evidence. And that is a serious breach, Mr. Speaker, because if we do not base the rule of law on evidence, then there is no proper rule of law. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, to consider what happened to that party over there that promised accountability. I think of the Canadian Alliance minority response to the case of contempt found against the Liberals. Said, Mr. Speaker, this is what the Canadian Alliance at the time said. I'm holding up a moral mirror for them to look in, but I don't think any of them want to look up. This contempt cannot be dismissed as mere forgetfulness that might occur in the heat of questioning. Instead, it is a deliberate act to mislead. Parliament cannot exercise that vigilance when it is misled or lied to. To mislead Parliament shows contempt for Parliament. It must not be tolerated at any time. And that's what we're talking about today, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about a member who came into the House not once, but twice, and lied about witnessing crimes that never occurred. He then waited 19 days for his correcting the record. He never apologized. The honorable thing to do when you make a mistake is to apologize. He never apologized. But, Mr. Speaker, if you stand up in the House and claim to have witnessed crimes and don't follow through, then you are certainly culpable. So I imagine my honorable colleague, and I still call him honorable, even though what he's done is very dishonorable, the honorable member for Mississauga-Streetsville, if he claimed to have witnessed a crime and was emphatic that he saw fraud being committed, well, he had a legal responsibility to report that. But he didn't, did he? Because he was making it up. So he put himself in a very difficult position to be a spokesperson for this government on a bill that's taking away basic rights of Canadians to vote on the premise that they witnessed crimes that never occurred. So we're in a situation, Mr. Speaker, where within the Westminster tradition, the decision that will be made from this committee has to look beyond the narrow interests of the Conservative war machine. And I'm very disturbed, Mr. Speaker, about their willingness to do this, because we've seen time and time again that they put their narrow interests ahead of the larger obligation that we all have as parliamentarians. We saw it with Bev Oda, a disgraced minister who was found in contempt of Parliament for lying. Was there any consequences? No, there weren't. We found that for this government that prorogued, shut down Parliament to stop an inquiry into abuse of the Afghan detainees. That report has never really been dealt with, Mr. Speaker, but it still remains a black mark on Canada because it wasn't dealt with. But they actually shut down the work of Parliament rather than get to the bottom of whether or not this happened. We remember the other prorogation where they shut down the work of Parliament in order to avoid a non-confidence vote. It is a larger contempt of democratic privileges that we're seeing here. So if we see this government attempt to shut down the debate in this House about whether or not it's okay to come in and lie while law is being decided, then that sets a precedent that shows other countries in the parliamentary system, Mr. Speaker, that Canada holds the parliamentary tradition very cheap. And I think you would agree with me that we need a higher standard. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've heard tonight all manner of prevarications from the Conservatives about how, we're all supposed to get together and show respect for one another. And I would love to believe that, Mr. Speaker, but really it's like being invited down to have a picnic with the alligators at this point in the night. I just don't believe it. Because I've seen in the committee work where every good amendment that's brought forward is routinely rejected, where basic work of Parliament is always put in camera so that they could abuse their majority, that they don't show any interest in working with the other parties. And whenever colorful, they say colorful, to them colorful is the same as lying. It's not, Mr. Speaker. Passion is not the same as misrepresenting the truth. But they say everyone embellishes. They say everyone torques. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's simply not true. Stand up. Tell me I'm a liar.
Order. 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 The honourable members will take a seat. The honourable member will order. Okay. Just a word to all honourable members. Certainly, we're aware of the context of the question that's before the House. Nevertheless, the reference and the use of the word lie in the context of that debate, lie is still considered an unparliamentary language. Even in this context, members are aware that this is a question that will be referred to the committee if the House so decides when this debate is finished, and it will then be taken up under consideration. The drawing conclusions as to what the committee may find on that question, probably we may be getting ahead ourselves if we're choosing to use that type of language in the course of the debate. So I would ask all honourable members to perhaps measure their words in that respect and not pre-conclude what the committee may decide. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really appreciate. I think that you are an excellent speaker and you're very judicious. It's unfortunate my colleagues on the other side will say anything off camera in order to divert attention from what we're dealing with here, Mr. Speaker. So they might want to act like a clown act in a sports bar, but we're dealing with the parliamentary tradition here and the question of if someone walks in to deliberately mislead this House, that cannot be taken cheaply, Mr. Speaker. If someone is dealing with legislation and claims to have witnessed a crime that never occurred, that is an attempt to undermine the work of fellow legislators because they're claiming that they have evidence. And if they cannot bring evidence and they decide to make up evidence, well, Mr. Speaker, that is mendacity of the worst sort. And if we decide that simply because they have a majority, that it is okay to misrepresent, that simply because they have a majority, it's okay to make up facts, that if they have a majority, Mr. Speaker, it's okay to say whatever they want, whenever they do it, as long as if they get caught, they come in and correct. Well, that's not, Mr. Speaker. You will look at the Westminster tradition around the world, and nowhere is such a cheap standard allowed. I point out, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not asking for what the committee will find. Again, I would actually be very surprised if a Conservative-dominated committee will ever take the issue of parliamentary work and the obligation to the Westminster tradition above their own narrow self-interest. But in Australia, Mr. Speaker, it's a crime. People go to jail. It's a serious issue. So what happens here, Mr. Speaker, is serious. For members to come in, make things up, misrepresent, and claim to have witnessed crimes that never occurred, there has to be consequences. Shame would be certainly a strong consequence, but I haven't seen any shame over on that side tonight, Mr. Speaker, so I look forward to the committee's work.